Conflict of interest in the family empire. This is how their family's story ended. Conflict of interest, greed, and ambition destroyed what had been built up over decades. And everything could have been different if they could have agreed and worked together for the common good. Michael sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. Outside the window, the autumn wind rustled the leaves on the pavement, as if reminding him of the inevitable changes. Inside the office, silence reigned, broken only by the quiet clicks of keyboard keys as Michael scrolled through the lines of the company's earnings report for the last quarter. The numbers were dismally low. Looking at the numbers, he could barely restrain himself from swearing out loud. Everything seemed so fragile, as if the empire his father had been building for decades was about to fall apart. When his father, Richard, stepped down, handing the reins over to his sons, Michael truly believed he could carry on his work. Yes, of course, there were moments of doubt, but he never thought he would face such a serious problem so quickly. 6 months had passed since his father's death, and all the plans Michael had made were crumbling right before his eyes. The company, once thriving, now seemed weakened and depleted. Customers were starting to leave, competition was intensifying, and revenues were falling. Each new day brought another problem: late payments, disgruntled suppliers, employees losing faith in management. All of this was piling up like a snowball and now threatened to bury all the work that had been done for generations. Michael remembered how his father had often said, "Business is a family." That's why he tried to involve all of his relatives in the decision-making process. But it turned out that family ties are not always strong enough to keep the company afloat. Especially when internal disagreements arise. And now, looking at the reports, Michael could feel the tension building in his chest. He got up from his desk, walked to the window and looked down at the streets of New York City. The city that had once seemed like home to him now felt alien and hostile. People were rushing about their business, cars were honking, and no one noticed that an entire empire was crumbling inside one of the skyscrapers. Returning to his desk, Michael picked up a pen and began to take notes. Something urgent had to be done. Perhaps he should reconsider the development strategy, cut costs, or find new partners. But every suggestion that came to his mind seemed insufficiently effective. He realized that one solution would not be enough. He needed a comprehensive approach that would require time and effort. Michael sighed and closed the report file. He knew he had a tough road ahead of him. But he wasn't about to give up. After all, this wasn't just a business, it was his father's legacy, and he owed it to himself to do everything he could to keep it going. His family had been prominent in New York City for decades. Michael's father, Richard, started with a small restaurant in the center of the city, and then gradually expanded the business, buying real estate and opening new outlets. Behind every step was labor, patience, and perseverance. At first it was one restaurant, then a second, third. Soon Richard became the owner of a number of successful establishments, attracting the attention of tourists and locals. Then followed investments in real estate, office buildings, residential complexes, hotels. Each new acquisition strengthened their family's position in the city. When Richard retired, the management of the company passed to Michael and his younger brother David. The brothers agreed to divide the assets equally, believing they could continue to work together as efficiently as their father had done. But very soon it became obvious that each of the brothers had their own interests and plans for the future. David always dreamed of a career in politics. Even in his youth, he imagined climbing the career ladder, starting as mayor of New York and ending as governor of the state. His ambitions were enormous, and he was willing to go to any lengths to achieve his goal. To do so, he needed money and connections, and the family business seemed the perfect source of resources. Michael, on the other hand, was fully immersed in running the company. He saw himself as the successor of his father's business. He wanted to develop the business, to open new restaurants and hotels, to strengthen his position in the market. He believed that this was the true legacy of the family, and his main goal was to preserve and increase what Richard had created. But David saw things differently. He believed that it was time to move forward, seek new horizons, and use the available resources to achieve personal goals. That's why he insisted on selling some of his assets to finance his election campaign. "We must preserve what Dad built," Michael exclaimed, trying to convince his brother. "It's our family pride." David only grinned in response. He thought that Michael was too attached to the past to see the future. Times are changing, Mike, he said confidently. We need to move forward. Sell a couple of buildings, invest in politics, and I guarantee you I'll come back with a profit. Imagine the clout we'll have if I become mayor. It would open doors we've never even dreamed of. Michael didn't agree. He saw no point in selling what their father had worked so hard to build. It wasn't just an asset, it was a memory, a tradition, the foundation of their success. But David was adamant. He persuaded, coaxed, argued, citing possible benefits and prospects. Think about it, Mike, he said, leaning closer. If I win the election, our ties will be unlimited. We'll be able to sign lucrative contracts, get government contracts. Can you imagine the opportunities that will open up before us? Michael hesitated. He realized that his brother could really succeed in politics, but his heart resisted. Selling the assets seemed to him a betrayal of his father's memory and a threat to the stability of the company. But David kept pushing, using his influence in the family and among friends. Eventually, Michael relented. It was decided to sell 2 buildings in Midtown Manhattan. The deal was successful, and David received the necessary funds. He immediately began to realize his political ambitions, launching a large-scale election campaign. The money received from the sale of assets was used for advertising, events, meetings with voters and support of influential people. David was confident that success was near, and spared no expense to promote his name. Meanwhile, Michael watched with growing concern. Instead of investing the money back into the business as his brother had promised, David was spending it on the campaign without thinking about the consequences. Michael tried to convince him to change his strategy, to remind him to keep the company going, but David ignored his advice. He was so engrossed in his political career that he almost ceased to be interested in the affairs of the family business. A year passed, and things actually got worse. David lost the election, which came as a surprise to many, including himself. But far more alarming was the state of the company. Restaurants that used to be packed with customers were now closing one by one. Hotels were half empty, customers were leaving, and revenues were rapidly declining. Michael realized that the situation was critical, but did not know how to remedy the situation. He tried to take the initiative, developed new strategies, held meetings with employees, but everything was in vain. The company was in free fall, and it seemed impossible to stop the process. Employees began to quit, fearing for their future, and those who remained worked without much enthusiasm, seeing that the management had lost control of the situation. Michael spent sleepless nights reviewing financial reports and analyzing the mistakes made over the past months. He realized that the mistake had been made long before the election, when they had decided to sell the assets. But at the time, it had seemed like a temporary measure necessary to achieve a common goal. No one had expected the consequences to be so devastating. Each day brought new difficulties, payments were delayed, suppliers refused to cooperate, tenants were looking for new premises. Michael felt that he was losing control over the situation, and despair was gripping him more and more. One evening, sitting at the bar of one of his restaurants, Michael noticed a familiar figure at the counter. It was Jonathan, an old family friend with whom they had maintained a friendly relationship over the years. Jonathan had always taken an interest in their business, and although he had other projects of his own, his bond with the family remained strong. Jonathan approached Michael, smiled and ordered a glass of wine. They exchanged a few words about the weather and the latest news, but soon the conversation turned to more serious topics. Jonathan listened attentively to Michael when he shared his concerns about the state of the company. Seeing that things were going badly, Jonathan offered to buy some shares in the company to save it from bankruptcy. "Listen, Michael," Jonathan said, leaning closer. "I know this is hard for you right now. But I can help. Let's do it together. I'll invest the money, help stabilize the situation, and then we'll find a way out of the crisis." Michael hesitated. The offer sounded tempting, but the thought of handing over part of the family business to an outsider caused him mixed feelings. He realized that there was no other option, but he was still hesitant. In the end, he decided to discuss it with his brother. The next day, Michael met with David in his office. He tried to calmly explain Jonathan's proposal, explaining that it might be the only way out of the situation. But David's reaction was completely unpredictable. "You want to sell our family? You traitor!" David shrieked, getting up from the table. His face was red with anger, his eyes glittering. "How can you even think of such a thing? This is our inheritance, our treasure. We can't just give it away to someone else." Michael tried to explain that it was a temporary measure, that they would find a way to regain control of the company, but David wasn't listening. He was so outraged that he couldn't hear any arguments. It was firmly entrenched in his mind that Michael was betraying their family by deciding to sell the stock. "No, Michael," David said, rising to his feet. "I'm not going to let that happen. You're going to handle this on your own. Or not, but I won't be a part of this betrayal." With those words, he turned abruptly and walked out of the office, slamming the door loudly. Michael remained seated at his desk, feeling his world crumbling around him. He hadn't expected such a reaction from his brother, but now he realized that he couldn't count on his support. At that moment he felt completely alone, realizing that now he would have to make decisions on his own, without the support of anyone close to him. A week after the heated conversation in the office, Michael received notice that David had filed a lawsuit against him. The lawsuit demanded a division of assets and compensation for David's share of the company. This came as a real blow to Michael. He did not expect that his brother would go to such extreme measures, and now their relationship was on the verge of a complete breakdown. Litigation dragged on for months. Every day brought more trouble. Attorneys on both sides argued fiercely, gathering evidence and providing documents. Michael tried to protect the interests of the company, but each step became more and more difficult. The media, having learned about the internal conflicts in their family, began to actively cover this topic, making a real sensation out of it. Reports and articles appeared daily, and each new publication dealt another blow to the company's reputation. Customers, reading the news about family discord, began to lose trust in the brand. Many of them preferred to leave for competitors, fearing that the unstable situation in the management would affect the quality of services provided. Restaurants and hotels emptied out, revenues continued to fall, and employees, seeing that the company was on the verge of collapse, began to quit in droves. Michael struggled to keep the business afloat, but each day brought more disappointment. He tried to establish contact with his brother, to propose a peaceful resolution of the conflict, but David was adamant. He insisted on his right to compensation and was not going to back down. Finally, after months of litigation, the court ruled the assets should be divided and the company liquidated. It meant the end of an era. Michael had lost everything his father had built. He sat in his office looking at old photographs and couldn't believe it had ended so sadly. David, too, was left with nothing but bitterness and anger. Although he had achieved a division of the assets, he had not been able to capitalize on it. The company no longer existed, and all that remained were memories of the past and a sense of loss. Their relationship was irrevocably broken, and both brothers realized that there would be no going back. Today, Michael sits in his empty office looking at old photographs. One of them shows him with his father and brother, happy and confident about the future. Now everything has changed. The family business is ruined, relationships damaged forever. Michael realizes he made a mistake in giving in to his brother. But it's too late to change anything. Time has passed, and with it went the dream of a great family empire. And so ended the story of their family. Conflict of interest, greed, and ambition destroyed what had been decades in the making. But everything could have been different if they had been able to agree and work together for the common good.